Welcome to WayWORD Festival 2022 and to this event with Michael Pedersen. I'm Naomi Christie. I'm the administrative coordinator here at the festival. That's a mouthful, but I've got my chairing hat on today. We have the lovely Michael here with us, beaming in from Canada.
Hi there.
How are you, Michael?
Very good. Just sitting on the 34th floor of a big, tall, skinny skyscraper of a building in Toronto.
Sounds fun. Are you enjoying it?
Great. Yeah, we just did the big opening night show last night, which was a big festival of international literature. It was myself, Irvin Welsh, Holly McNish, a New Zealand writer, Dominic Hoy, an Australian Malaysian writer, Omar Musa. And now we've got all our own sort of scattered events over the next few days. So this is the start of my big US and North America tour for boyfriends. So we're going from like Toronto to Montreal to Harvard to New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and some digital ballrooms in between. But right now we're beaming into Aberdeen.
I know, I wish I could be in two places at once, honestly.
Come on over.
So everybody, Michael and I met up back in June here in Aberdeen, and that was before the book even came out, I think, for a lovely chat about boyfriends. This lovely book here, beautiful cover, and a nosy around the lovely Divinity Library in King's College and a general wander around the old Aberdeen campus. We recorded our chat and we'll play it all for you in a minute. It's about 40 minutes long. And then Michael will appear again live at the end to answer some audience Q&As. So please submit those at any point through the Q&A function on Zoom. It's just at the bottom of your screen there. So I'm sure Michael needs a little introduction for you all, but I'll go ahead and do it anyway. Michael Pedersen is a Scottish author. He's published 2 acclaimed collections of poetry with Polygon Books, the most recent of which, this one here, was illustrated by the late Scott Hutchison of Frightened Rabbit. And then his smashing prose debut, Boyfriends, was published by Faber and Faber in July this year. Michael has also written pop songs for bands, short plays for National Theatre of Scotland and Edinburgh Art Festival. He won the Robert Louis Stevenson Fellowship and the John Mathers Trust Rising Star of Literature Award, and was a finalist for Writer of the Year at the Herald Scottish Culture Awards. And in 2010,
no proof of any of it.
In 2010, Michael co-founded the prize-winning literary collective Nói Riki, which has produced many shows in Scotland and internationally. And his writing has attracted acclaim from big juicy names such as Irvin Welsh, Jackie Kay, Stephen Fry, Shirley Manson, Kay Tempest, David Shrigley, Charlotte Church, and Scott Hutchison. So a few housekeeping bits before we play the recording. WayWORD Festival is brought to you by the Word Centre for Creative Writing with the generous support of Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council and the University of Aberdeen, so huge thank you to them. Auto captions have been enabled and you can toggle them on and off with the CC button at the bottom right of your screen. We also have the incredible Leslie Creer doing BSL interpretation. Please do pin her via Zoom if you're a BSL user. Okay. I think that's grand. We'll roll the recording and Michael will see you again live in 40 minutes or so.
Sounds great. See you soon.
The book starts off on your residency in Northern Ireland, a few months after you lost your friend Scott Hutchison. I wanted to know whether you had other stuff planned to write, because I assumed that you had that residency in place before that happened, and then how this book came out instead, sort of how it came to you.
Yeah, absolutely. This book was entirely accidental in some perspectives. We were curating that, it's called the Curfew Tower in Northern Ireland. Yeah. It's owned by artist and provocateur Bill Drummond, and he gives it to different organisations every year. Normally visual arts people, so people go out there to make, film and sculptural art. But we were given it as a literary organisation. So we were divvying up the months ahead. It's right on the coast. It can be known for quite punishing winds and temperatures. So obviously I did the big sacrifice and took the really tough month of July.
Right.
I heard that was going to be the most difficult and hardy month to bear. Ended up being a bit of a sort of heat wave. And in the coastal town of Cushendall. So yeah, I'd planned to go there to write the third poetry collection.
Right.
And then obviously Scott disappeared and then left the planet in May, and I had this residency planned, and the period of time between that happening and me going on the residency was, you know, a lifetime in some respects, but was also just this lightning blur really quickly. So I found myself on residency. A few people were, I guess, trepidatious, thinking, should you really be going into this place of solitude for a month at this emotionally volatile time? But, you know, I'd fought for this residency. I'd cleared the decks to be able to be there. And I was aware of the fact that I could then disappear from everyone and revisit this friendship with a depth and almost a divinity in a secular fashion. That I wouldn't be able to do amongst the hubbub of Edinburgh and Glasgow. So I definitely did intend to write a poetry collection when I was there. That was the plan. But it just didn't come out that way. I was sort of consumed by thoughts about Scott and friendship and life and mortality and all of these different things. So I started writing this document of the road trip I'd just been on with Scott, half because I didn't want to forget any of the details. Had this paranoia about your brain being able to cover over painful memories or lock them up or hide them away from you, and I didn't want that to happen. So I started writing down all of the elements of this road trip, but it unlocked something, a sort of fact-finding scavenge within me. All of these seminal moments within my friendship with Scott started harking back to these different friendships of my childhood, and to understand who I was in the friendship with Scott, I had to understand sort of how I got there and this evolution through friendship. So I started writing in prose, which was almost, I felt like, kidnapped by the prose. I didn't intend to write in that manner. I thought, well, this is just going to be a big archive document. This is going to be some sort of annal, and then I'll draw the poems out of it at a later date. But it gave me something to focus on, to capturing all these details, something that was quite a sort of almost an obsessive travel journal style of writing. And I just got up and sat at the desk every day and started writing this, and it was not supposed to be a book. It was supposed to be reference and material and writing for my own course and good. And I would write the diaries of the Curfew Tower on long seaside walks and things I was up to, because that was an easy way into it before catapulting straight into, you know, life and death and friendship and reverie and all these things. I would just write about day-to-day activities and what had been going on, and then found myself jumping back in time after that. It was almost like galvanized me to be able to do that. It was the keystone to jumping through those hoops. And then I came back to the writing months later, once it was this quite abundant thing, and thought, right, well, I'll transform this into poems. But it refused. It was really sort of obdurate with me. It wouldn't form into poems. It wouldn't change into poems. And then because it had set off this whole scavenge into my own past, into these boyhood friendships, I just continued that narrative, and yeah, I guess the book came around entirely by surprise, but it was by no means the intention or even a consideration when I went over to Northern Ireland in July. It just became compulsion, really. It was me trying to consume and distract myself with capturing detail in a way that was conducive, because if I hadn't had some sort of foresight to sit down and write any way, I would have been a bit more WayWORD.
No, I think, yeah, you're right. You just had to sort of follow that instinct then. So as you said, you kind of walk us through your male friendships over the years, and I wanted to know how you found the balance of telling stories. You say something in the book where you talk about a story with Scott in South Africa that you wanted to keep just for you, and it got me thinking about how special memories with friends are, and how you find the balance of keeping those sort of magic things that are just between two people, that are just shared between two people, and how you decided what would go in the book and what you would keep for yourself.
Yeah, I guess maybe an earlier incarnation of this book was a bit more voluminous, and it just gave everything, every detail, every thought, every fragment, because it was fleshier, it was angstier, it was sort of stream of consciousness style writing just pouring out of me. And then I honed it down, and I honed it down to things which were deeply personal, but I thought, is there a universality here? Is somebody reading this going to be able to say, oh, me too. Like that harks back to my own friendship. This reminds something, this sets off a trigger in me, which enables me to then relate to or delve into a friendship which has been important to me. So it was whether I felt there was a gesture in it, there was something reaching outwards. I didn't want to write a book which was just somebody looking over my shoulder and seeing this splash of my life. I wanted it to be a conversation about friendship and using obviously my own stories and my life experience as the conduit for that. But was there something wider ranger there? Was it making a point? Would it offer companionship for someone if they read it at that point in time in their life? Was there something there which was open-ended and open-armed? And the little story about the road trip in South Africa and the safari trip and little elements of events that we saw that nobody else on the truck saw, I guess, was just a little bit of a provocation about and keeping a little spot for me in the same way that we kept that. So I guess I gave everything, and then I decided what was conducive, what made a story. Because it wasn't supposed to be a book, it didn't have a narratorial arc at front. It wasn't taking the reader on this journey. So I had to look deeply at what events I felt would allow someone to project their own life into it and would see a semblance of the world that they surround themselves by. Or else it would be a more closed piece of literature which really would have no productive purpose for me from that perspective. So I guess I wrote it all and honed it down, and definitely had to think in a very strange manner about how it worked as a whole, because it was written in it was over so many different timelines, and it's like, how am I going to carry someone through that without befuddling them or confusing them?
Well, I imagine there was also some getting in touch with people and check if they minded that you told stuff in the book. I don't know.
There's a process you go through.
Yeah.
There's a lot of details and name changes as well. So a lot of people aren't called their names. And I looked at it and I thought, look, is this celebratory about this individual? Does this celebrate who they were and what this friendship was? And then by that, because you're telling it from your own point of view and your own perspective, then that's permission enough, provided you're authentic to it. You get a legal read as well. You know, if there's nefarious behaviour of alcohol and drug taking, sometimes there's obfuscation to be done with certain characters there. One of the funniest things with the legal read is there's a point in the book where I talk about how we didn't really have any writers or artists in our family, but my granny was a cleaner, and she used to clean the quite palatial flat of this writerly couple, and they had these huge libraries and their writing desks, and it looked like, you know, the writer's flat that I would get gooey for at that point in time. So I went in for a voyeuristic peek at it, and I talked about how I stole a swatch. And the lawyer was like, should you really be admitting to stealing a swatch from these people's property? I was like, no, that's just a glance. It's just a look at something in Scots language. So things crop up in the legal read. They've got your back. They've got your back.
I loved when you talked about wanting Scott to meet your other friends, and you said by seeing them you saw a little more of me, and I totally agree with that. I think friends are like a kind of physical manifestation of different facets of ourselves, and I think they say you are the sum of the 5 closest people to you or something, or you're the average of your closest friends. Do you agree with that then?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, friendships are the most ubiquitous form of relationship we'll have in our lives. We'll make, lose, war with, expire, forge into more friends than any other category of human relationship, unless you're a very, very prolific lover, which is uncommon to the levels of friendship that we're talking about. So, and it's friendships that perdure. It's friends whose arms will fall into when romantic relationships in the more typical sense break down. It's friends who, I guess, anchor us, I feel like, most into different periods of our lives, in high school and university and adulthood, going through them. And I think people's story about how they came across friends, because they're so carefully selected, you know, there's no family ties behind friendships a lot of times. There's the whole Aristotle's, you know, friendships by accident and friendships by deliberation, but we work really hard on our friendships, just as hard as any other form of relationship, and there's a longevity to them, I think, which is so important. And what I guess I've learned through talking about this is
people really don't feel like they get asked about their friends enough. Like any time we ask someone to quote or blurb the book, they would give me a little really pithy, beautiful sentence if it connected with them. And then at the second half, or not even the second half, like 80% of the email was in a story about a friend of theirs that they wanted to talk about, whether it was a friend that was no longer in their life or it was a friend they see all the time. But because they're so commonplace, it's not honoured in terms of the significance of the relationship that they've, I guess, has punctuated their life from that perspective. And I think we feel like our friends, there is a friend for every moment in every situation, because we can have so many different friends that relate to the different version of ourselves, the serious version, the silly version, the sexy version, the smutty version. We have friendships which, I guess, satisfy or create this communicational currency between us, that element of us and that element of them. And friendships can be so separate from different parts of our lives, because we could have connected over something really visceral in us that we don't want to share wider ranging in that. And I guess the notion is, if you're in a romantic situation with someone, you give them all facets of you. Whereas friendships can be really particular to a brand of your identity. So I definitely do feel like, I say it in the prologue, and I'm pretty vehement about it, like if there was some sort of, you know, spiritual reckoning at the end of it, I would be quite content being judged by the 5 closest friends that I've kept in my life, and the amount of love I've invested in them, and I guess got back from that perspective as well. But yeah, I think the parliament of friends we surround ourselves by are be our most carefully and assiduously curated exhibition of love that is going to permeate our lifespan.
Beautifully put. Food comes up a lot, and wine, and it's clearly a thing that you and Scott bonded over, but also other friends. What role do you think food plays in friendship then?
Huge. I love eating, and I love food metaphors. There's so much like sensory experience in a meal. So there's a lot of food metaphors, and there's a lot of food eating in there. But I think it's often fought for moments as well. I'm not a big fan of eating on the run. I like to sit down and I like to eat with people, and it's nourishment at the same time. You're providing sustenance to the body. It provides conversational sustenance. I feel like you can sort of match the food to the vibrancy of the occasion, whether you're eating sort of Central American food that you're assembling yourself, or, you know, there's a whole theatrics around it as well. And it's taking a moment down to sit down with someone and talk about, you know, flavors and experience. And it's such a quite a sort of intimate thing to do, to eat in front of someone as well. So I personally feel you have to be pretty comfortable sometimes. I'll affect what I order sometimes in situations, because I feel like this meal will be conducive to this type of sociology we've got going on. But, you know, it's the closest I think we can be to almost like, from a sensory perspective, masturbating in public. Is like eating this delicious meal with someone. And often, whether you're at a festival or you're doing a show together or you're on a tour or something, it's these moments like fought for and pulled away from the crowd or the vociferousness of the concert that's about to come up. So they're little stolen spaces. They can be little liminal spaces or little secret portals. And yeah, I just love flavors and foods and the cultural significance of it all. I can mark my day and I'll mark my life in some of the most significant meals, because I'll have been sitting opposite some of the most significant people in my life as well. And I think it's one of the best treats and nourishments you can give yourself, is to sit down with food for someone you deeply care for and admire. Also in grief, when it flips round, like sometimes conversation doesn't come correctly, or it arrives miswired or all bent out of shape, but actually to make someone a meal and sit down and feed them, or take someone out for dinner and say, look, you don't have to talk, but let's eat together. I can nourish you in that fashion. So it has this sort of healing quality alongside it as well. But yeah, it's deeply personal, but like deeply sexy and fun at the same time. I'm going to read 2 short sections from the book. The first is because I had my appetite whet from all of those scrumptious food references earlier on. So it's a feasting sequence. And the second section is the final part of the book that I think I signed off creatively. And it was an editorial note I was responding to about what grief feels like in the body, how it manifests itself. 1. Dinner with you and Holly. These are Palmery moments. No, I don't regret spending £75 on a seafood sharing platter. Aye, it was a crumb indulgent, and you call me a lush to Holly's hilarity, but we are twinned in this bonhomie. I do not regret us gorging ourselves on a platter boasting an estimated 40 mussels, 60 prawn tails, 6 gargantuan langoustines, 12 scallops, and a heft of dipping bread. A platter most definitely intended for filling more than 2 bellies. Of course, there is wine. We would not do a meal such as this a disservice and be without it. The platter is its own constellation. It does not fit on the table, for its circumference is akin to Jupiter, not decommissioned Pluto. You and Holly have to swap seats so as we can battle this formidable foe together in formation. We are leviathans, feasting with and on each other. The messy display attracts nods of reverence from onlookers, populating the tables in orbit around us. These nods are a cloud of praise comfortably taken. This comfort in taking praise is far too rare for brilliant you. Over yonder, the island of Skye sits down to tea with us. We address it in stories and long glances cast over. On Google Maps, this water is labelled Inner Seas off the west coast of Scotland, Atlantic Ocean, a very formal name for our salty guest, the ghost at the table. Whilst eating the platter, there is a dearth of chatter. It has given way to unwavering dedication. Let it be known, this is not portentous, it is the opposite, the gooey vim of not needing chit-chat. We are apples, here's our core, sprouting pips in every belly. Even vegetarian Holly soaks a musseldin, but shh, don't tell her family, or she'll never hear the end of it. This supper was garlic butter gorgeous, love on its tiptoes, the last meal we had together and one of your last on this whizzing planet. It isn't quite fit for purpose, but I surmise you chip in with Michael. It wasn't far off either. P.S. Yes, we ordered starters and all, but these were modest and too alluring to let pass by. The pudding you shared with Holly was one step beyond for me, but yous looked angelic splitting it, and you were often one step ahead. P.P.S. By the time the £149.50 plus £20 cash tip cleared from my bank account, 3 days later you had left us and something had left me. But right there, in that moment, we were brimful. It was love.
I want to talk to you about honesty and about grief. And in the book, you talk about how you struggle to tread that line of being too honest about grief and giving the appropriate amount, whatever that is, which I struggled with. And I think it's especially difficult when you lose somebody to suicide or substance abuse or something that's, I guess, taboo is the word. Mm-hmm. Have you discovered sort of how to be honest about it without freaking people out?
Yeah, I talk a lot about mechanisms for grieving and like what is necessary for your own self to cauterize wounds and what you can share in terms of a dialogue or a vocabulary. I think more and more now I err on the side of oversharing rather than undersharing. Also, if somebody went through a grief, I think I'll always mention it, and I know a lot of people will sort of butter over it and say, I know you probably don't want to speak about this, and I feel people often do. So I'll always come in directly with it, and I think I would much rather accidentally affront someone and have them say, I would rather not talk about this under these circumstances, and find your way into it than ignore it. I think it's one of the worst things people could do. I think we really need to develop a vocabulary for what is a good grief at this point in time. There's a lot of deaf cafes and dying matters charities and stuff, to just get people accustomed to talking about grief prior to it being, you know, all-encompassing, prior to being in the throes of shock experiencing a grief. If we can develop a dialogue for talking about the finite nature of life, and for addressing these matters prior to it happening, and just having this grief vocabulary as part of our sort of day-to-day cognizance, but in a celebratory manner. You know, I'm trying to start this good grief salon style thing. We did one at the book festival last year. We're doing another this year, and invite people to come and celebrate grief with us, to tell me about mechanisms for grief or their experiences with grief. And that can actually be quite blithe and quite loose. People can talk about grieving a missed opportunity or a previous version of themselves. Most people, of course, will talk about someone they've lost, because it is a universal currency. So that makes it all the more sort of flummoxing and bamboozling, that we find it so difficult to jump into it, because as soon as we start talking about grief, there's no one in the room that hasn't been affected by it or hasn't had awkward conversations about it that they wish were a bit more free-flowing and sustaining. So I guess when we experience nervosity about talking about grief with people, I just remind myself that alongside life, it is the universal currency, and people will quickly let you know if it's too much too soon for them.
Yeah.
And then, as I say, you've got things to fall back on, like nourishing people with food. But I think much like I was with love and excitement and emotions, I've always maybe given too much, and you don't know how long it's been since somebody's been asked about these things. It can be a real gift if someone wants to talk to you about pain and trauma and understanding, because so few people, either by being underconfident in doing so or just being reluctant to do so, really ask you about the depth of your grief and are there willing to listen to about it and share their own experiences and buttress that from that perspective. So it can be a really special moment, and it's something that I think always leaves us fortified afterwards. So I've not worked out an exact formula for it, but one of these big things in my life is going to be running these good grief salons with another writer, Gemma Kearney, and it's all about inviting people to come and celebrate grief in us, because grief is just the missing in loving. You know, we wouldn't be grieving that hard if it's the final frontier of loving someone, is having all this love to give them and them not being around to input into, and we have to work out what to do with that in their absence.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned depictions of male grief specifically, and that they tend to be portrayed as violent and angry. And I went and read C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, which you talked about in the book, which was beautiful and amazing and made me cry, definitely. But I mean, that felt like it was probably pretty bold for him to talk like that as a man at that time. And then there's this incredible sort of foreword from his stepson where he talks about feeling embarrassed to talk about his mum in case he cried, which is just tragic. Oh,
wow. I've not got the foreword. I've got an old, early edition of it as well.
The foreword's beautiful, and he because I think C.S. Lewis mentions that his stepson seemed embarrassed whenever he brought up their mum, and the stepson was kind of clarifying that he was only embarrassed because he was scared that he would cry, which just is incredibly sad. So I don't know, do you think we've come on from then with male grief, you know?
I hope so, even with that book, and that was a long time ago it was published, but it wasn't originally published under his name. Because they didn't want, I don't know if that was a personal choice or they didn't want to bring that ferocity of frontline grieving into the story of someone that wrote Narnia and line, which these are sort of incredible fantastical books. Do we need to see this side of this human being? But it was so emotionally vulnerable, you know. He gutted himself in front of us, and he was working out his day-to-day, and he reached no real solid conclusions. He just showed the inconsistency of grief, and all of the times that he thought he'd stabilized himself, he would then crumble. But in being that candid, it was such a beacon of hope to people trying to, I guess, temper or balance out their own emotions at that point in time. So it was beautiful little slim volume, and I was glad I hadn't discovered it till much later in the writing process, because it might have been too influential for me. And so I sort of discovered it just as I was patching things off with the book, so I managed to parachute in this little almost like a book review of it. It becomes a life review as well. And there's a higher amount of grief literature on losing a spouse, I think, than any other category of relationship. But his was about that, but it seemed a bit more inviting in terms of, it seemed a bit more transferable to other forms of grief. It didn't seem as pinned down to grieving for this form or relationship of that. But I do think we're coming on now. You know, I think we are experiencing an age in literature, especially, which is obviously like a privileged pool of society, because you've got these artistically expressive people bearing soul and bearing witness to each other's pain and trauma a lot of the time, and putting it down really intelligently. But I think from a male perspective, some of the leading writers on this are people like Ocean Vuong, and even like Max Porter's Grief is the Thing with Feathers that came out on Faber a couple of years ago as well. There is this currency about open dialogues within grief, and I think the risk that we pose to ourselves, our relationships and others around us, if we do stomach this and swallow it all up. I mean, within a lot of males there's a loneliness epidemic at the moment, and people see this loneliness epidemic and they say, but he had lots of friends. It's like, it's not about the friendship network, it's about what you can reveal to themselves within the friendship network. Very popular social human beings are ending their own life or getting into deep psychological trauma because they're not able to spill all these emotions out of themselves because they feel ashamed or they don't feel a safety from any of that perspective. But I think there is a lot of new writers, and there is a more of a attuned and sensitive vocabulary. We've still got a long way to go, and I feel, I guess I was talking about mostly from the male perspective, one, because that's my experience, and two, because that's where most of the crappy statistics lie in terms of, you know, young male deaths, and I've been constantly surrounded by boys who are just trying to find a way to let their emotions loose in a public environment. And that's what was really interesting about that trope of going fishing to me from that perspective, is like all of a sudden you'd get these kids who would go away on fishing trips and they would start talking about all the stuff that I wanted to talk about too much too frequently as a young boy, but they would spill all these details. Now I couldn't correlate at first what was happening, and it was obviously because they were away from the school. They were in this natural environment. The type of emotional vocabulary they could employ to that situation felt more free and more safe there. They wouldn't dare talk like that in the corridor in front of other kids, but there was almost like an armory or a protection there. Two, defying all science, grief feels its hottest when newly lit, before it's even started smoking, before the birds know to stop singing and be forever silent, before the embargo on mooting a date for the funeral's been lifted, before one of my friends knows not to throw a strop because I haven't got back to his invite for a camping trip that needs the numbers, before any notion of talking in the past tense is fathomable, before Auden's poem, Stop All the Clocks, could possibly be about you. It feels like a drug that's newly entered the body and will deliberately dawdle in making the rounds. Inside like a virus, the flesh bullying itself, my vital organs like two best friends who for no real reason fallen out, yet on account of their hubris will never find a way back. Grief dissects us into our most helpless matter. My bones carry an unnatural weight in them, as if the marrow is turning to lead. My gait too is off, like that bike with its bent wheel that required me to cycle like fuck just to make it to market less than 2 miles away. I'm on the cusp of crying, ordering a cappuccino, but ask for chocolate sprinkles all the same, because that's what I used to do, although I have no idea why, because I've never had a sweet tooth. I'm desperate for touch, then offended by the suggestion. I find myself looking into my own eyes in every mirror I pass, eyes which have become bells that will not stop ringing until the jar cracks or the tongue falls out. Either way, it's over. It's been clumsy with meaning after having prided myself on exactitude, where 140 characters seems a stretch. It feels like I've had my last useful thought and now I'm salvaging ideas from the mulch. Time is standing still until it races by like a cat with a bird in its belly. Mostly, I feel exhausted, slow and eddying, heavier, whilst emptied of something I know will never be replenished, that I will always resent living without. I am heartbroken and coarse, whilst acutely thankful for all the wonderful, wonderful people around me. I feel important and guilty about it.
There's this incredible poetic providence that the fishing tackle shop that you mentioned became, Porty Bookshop, and you're quite hopeful that future generations will be able to walk around there and bond over art in a way that you probably needed or wished you had. And do you think boy friendships will sort of evolve in that way?
I hope so. I feel like there is a real generation of writers and artists that are in contact with their masculinity or the femininity within their masculinity or the sexuality within their masculinity in a way which was far less commonplace when I was growing up. There's a lot of gender conversations that spill into it. There's a lot of art which defies quite radically at times gender norms. And I think people are more comfortable finding their way together who maybe have that chemical balance of, effervescing emotionality to give to each other. Like, I definitely earned my stripes in the fishing tackle shop, feigning an interest in mallets and big hooks and tackle and that whole gathering of the arsenal, that warlike soldier-esque vocabulary. But it was all a show because I was trying to earn my way off into the campestral vastness because I knew at the other side of there was nature, there was a more freely spoken regime. You weren't judged by your peers to the same extent. You weren't worried about tripping up, about your own words, you being used against you. All the barriers and the guards of shame were down, and people would be more forgiving in those circumstances. And I think definitely there was a couple of us, and we were a safe pair of hands if you wanted to go off to the wilderness and talk about these things that maybe other boys weren't talking about, or maybe that you feared there would be repercussions or chides from absent classmates. If you were to expose too much too soon, we would be the ones that you would sort of take a party into the natural landscape with, to almost confess these things. And it felt like that. I guess that was part of the problems. Like, speaking about anything of an emotional timbre back then, or of emotional slam, felt like a confession. It felt like a secret that you had buried deep down that you weren't supposed to share with people. There wasn't this open currency of human emotion, and as soon as you get there and you hear the lapping waves in the sky, then maybe it was okay that it seeped out. But like, God forgive you if you try to bring that up in the common room at break time from that perspective. But I feel like there is this more attuned emotional vocabulary going on with younger generations. People are getting into poetry from a younger age, and there's this whole swarm of artists who are leading the way from that perspective. And that ceremony, that liminal parade of the tackle shop, is hopefully evaporating by the wayside. And there is this loneliness epidemic that is swallowing up a lot of the male population, and we need to gang together to support each other to overcome this. And it's sometimes, if it hasn't pervaded generations of this sort of more emotionally reserved manner has been passed down to you by your parents or your uncles or your older siblings, you do have to survive it. You do have to break out of that paradigm that has been enforced upon you if it doesn't feel comfortable for you, and it's risky. But I think the risks are always going to be worth taking if it feels natural in that way. And I think, we will find support and look for beacons in any place we can.
And do you think we'll get more boys holding hands platonically.
I hope so. It's a great test to play. I'm throwing down the gauntlet with the book there. If you're comfortable with your friends, if you feel like it will be consensual, take your friends' hands. It was something I was so jealous of growing up in terms of, you know, the female physical emotionality that went on, linking arms, holding hands, coddling each other, like supporting each other in this nurturous, womb-like, sibling-like fashion. It was so pervasive in female friendship and so absent in male friendship in the UK. But having spent time in Cambodia and Southeast Asia and seeing guys commonplacely holding hands and all over India, and seeing books by this photographer taking pictures of male friends holding hands in celebration of their friendship. That's why they were holding hands as well. It wasn't just to mark their friendship. It was a way of celebrating their friendship publicly in a showy fashion, and sometimes it should be put out there in a showy fashion. We worked bloody hard for these friendships. We've fought for each other, we've had each other's corners, so of course we should be able to showcase them in our best peacock feathers at times as possible. But yeah, hopefully there's less of the parodies going on, and there's just this real comfort to develop this emotional vocabulary, which will make us much better friends, lovers, human beings. Like, we have to listen to our own bodies like really intently these days, because they are our compass, they are our mind. The gut has a brain, the brain is a brain, the chest chamber has a brain. The more connected we can be to ourselves, the more powerful we can be as a human being, and the more use we can be to our friends and those we love.
Hello.
Hiya.
That was nice to look back on that. I haven't seen any of that yet.
No, me neither. Since the day, it was a pure Satsuma scorcher of a day in Aberdeen as well.
Yeah, it was beautiful. And you've had
I
a costume change.
had a costume change. I put my wee boyfriend's hand-painted t-shirt on. Also because I noticed I was wearing the same t-shirt as I had on in the day. So I thought that is a secondary reason for a costume change, to prove that I own more than one t-shirt. I felt that was necessary at that point in time.
Are you going to be making those to buy? Because I'd quite like one like that.
No, so we've got a wee collection of them. It's actually an artist called Ross Sinclair. He's a professor at Glasgow School of Art. He was drummer in the Soup Dragons. He's like does these brilliant real life art displays. National Gallery's got some of them, and he's made these t-shirts for different occasions. So he hand painted a group of them, of maybe about 12 or 15 of them. And he gave me 6 of them to give to wear at the launches, couple myself, and then to give to different people I was in conversation with at all of these different launch events. So I gave one to Bill Drummond, who I was speaking to when I was down in London at the launches. I gave one to Shirley Manson, who I was speaking to at the Edinburgh Book Festival. Gave one to Holly McNish, that I was doing a lot of the tour with, all of Ireland and lots of England. And then I kept a couple for myself. They're tricky to wash, being hand painted. So I need to, it was a particularly sweaty summer tour, so I needed to have a few of them in circulation at any one time to make it a pleasant experience for anyone that came into close contact with me.
There's nothing worse than owning a piece of clothing that's hand wash only, in my opinion, or anything that needs ironed. We're gonna go and have some audience Q&As. I've got one in the Q&A section here, and they're asking about travel. Travel's a big part of the book and your life, clearly. Do you find travel is crucial to bonding in your friendships compared to those friendships formed at home?
I think so, because I think if you're lucky enough to be able to travel with your friends, it offers you the opportunity to take them out of the day-to-day environment that they find themselves in, especially if I focus in on the friendship with Scott. When we did that book together, Oyster, that he illustrated and I did the poems, it was a creative collaboration from that perspective, but it was also the opportunity to go on holidays together and do shows that were further afield, and it would allow us to pull ourselves out of these busy creative environments that we would collaborate in and would collide a lot in, but would be surrounded by our friends and other people that were involved in them. And it would allow us to pluck ourselves out of the midst of that and put us in these really intimate environments where we were just basking in each other's company. And outside of the show, Scott wasn't on a band tour and I wasn't on an Oiriki tour, so it created this little bubble of intimacy that really cemented the friendships from that perspective. Plus, I love being in locomotion. I love the movement of travel. I love the new flavors, the new experiences, the new feasts and the new meals that you can have. As a writer, I take every single international opportunity that I get offered. I love doing UK tours. I love visiting new places. I love the language, the vernacular that comes with it. And often with a lot of the international shows, we try and pull in local performers. So there's this whole sort of human currency that goes alongside them. But I've always been restless. I've moved all over the UK. I've moved all over the world. I lived in Cambodia at one point, spent a lot of time out in Asia. Obviously on this, you find me on the middle of this big America tour at the moment. And I quite like writing in liminal spaces alongside it as well. And I guess write with most profundity about some of the friends that I've left back home when I'm traveling, because I'm missing them and I'm thinking about sharing these experiences with them if they're not here, and the little moments, performances or meals or beautiful horizons appear, and it's often someone different that you wish was there if you're on your own in these circumstances. So I never write or feel as passionately about my friends back in Scotland as when they're far away and I'm far away from them, imagining them into the situation.
It's probably the same reason you get so many nice songs about people missing Scotland and things like that when they're abroad. You know, you get that distance that you need to miss things and reflect on them.
So you create these unique narratives when you travel with someone, whether you're doing shows or whether it's just for the first for the world, to experience these new things together. And then you carry that new narrative, fresh narrative back into your friendship groups, into the sort of more quotidian day-to-day lives that you have back home, but you always are carrying little bits of yourself in these previous incarnations all across the world with you. And I think little bits of yourself maybe linger there, little atoms we leave in the air that leave us nostalgic for these places and these people.
Yeah, definitely. So another question is asking about your poem that was part of our Light Festival in Aberdeen, Spectra, and they're asking what the process for that poem was like, and I suppose the inspiration for it.
Yeah, Spectra was a great project for anyone that doesn't know about it, where Noiriki got to choose a few different writers that either were based in Aberdeen or had unique experiences there, or wrote about Aberdeenshire, or had a sort of shared synergy to the area. And we curated a group of poets, and then Spectra teamed them up with different light artists. And some of the poems were put into like neon bulbs, others were projected onto the buildings. There was this big wild like wheel carousel spinning around some of the words. So it was just a really illuminating project to be a part of, and poetry getting itself out there in those different incarnations where it melds into art or into animation or these sort of cross collaborative art forms has always been something which has really galvanized us at Noiriki. So it was a brilliant thing to get our teeth into. But it was recently in that poem, I guess they chose the line, "I'm also here because of a storm." The one that blew through and grabbed you away. Again, it was very much in narrative with boyfriends and this whole notion of missing Scott and the absences that he left in my life. And it was a friend of mine was putting on a play about a poet, Scottish war poet, Charles Hamilton Sorley. I guess he's Scotland's big, great war poet, and hailed from Aberdeen. There was a plaque unveiled to him, but he's not very well known about compared to, you know, Siegfried Sassoon or Wilfred Owen or any of the great war poets that are studied in classrooms. So it was this play was a real rallying call to see his name in lights and for Scotland to reconnect with his poetry. And I found myself up in Aberdeen, helping put on this play at the Tivoli Theatre, just sort of supporting it from an Oidiki perspective, and trying to create some, you know, positive energy around it. But just being so conscious of the fact that the reason that I was there was a friend would invite me to be part of this project, almost for us to do something together at this part in time where I was a little bit restless and a little bit listless. So even though I was doing this really beautiful creative artistic endeavor, it was a distraction from the brutality of missing someone. And it was just a storm had emptied Aberdeenshire, had thrown branches and across lawns, and it really sort of rang the neck of the city overnight. And I woke up to the carnage of it all, and there was just such a moment of feeling like that this beautiful thing I was doing was completely anchored or underpinned by this pretty gnarly storm, and it was just balancing out the beauty and the sadness of that line by line. So yeah, we submitted the poems, and that one about I'm also here because of the storm is the one that the artist related to. So I was really chuffed to be a part of that.
Yeah, it looked really cool. They had it, I think it was the one that was on Marshall College,
Yeah.
but all of them looked amazing. It's just very cool.
I actually inquired where the neons were. I was hoping to get it for above my bed
Oh,
or
yeah.
something like that.
I think they were made by an Edinburgh company, Solas Neon, which one of my friends worked for.
Nice.
So you could maybe hit them up. Maybe they've got
I could loan it for a special occasion.
Yeah.
Like light bulb library book.
Yeah. It might be too big for your room, I'm not sure.
It's highly possible.
So the other question we have is, most of your previous work is poetry. Had you written prose before, and how different is the writing process for prose?
Yeah, so poetry is my first port of call. Ideas come to me in these sort of poetic narratives, and it's always just really viscerally been the literary art form that I reached for, just by instinct, by compulsion. So it was quite befuddling when this book started coming out in prose, started coming out of diary entries. It arrived at a time that I was very much struggling to write or to even really clarify or calcify my own thought processes, how I felt about grief, about loss, about friendship, who I was in this sort of cataclysmic absence that had just ravaged through my life. So I guess that whole discombobulation of that period of time is responsible for these diary entries coming out first and foremost. And I definitely, as I say, I felt these diary entries were then going to be manipulated or sculpted into poems. I didn't think I was writing prose with any final endeavors to publish a prose book. It was coming free and easy, but I thought that's okay. This is just part of this mechanism to get me back into writing comfortably again. And the poetry will then, clamber up and out from within the shell of the prose, which will then drop away all the excess words. But then I just got really attached to it. I felt the prose sort of injected itself into my life at a time that I needed it. And then when it kept sprawling and it kept being a cathartic way of writing about friendship, there definitely came a point in time where I realized I wasn't just looking at an archive document anymore, but a prose book. However, I was constantly trying to Trojan horse poems into the book at every stage, sometimes by flattening them out and hiding them in between paragraphs, because the editor was saying, look, I'm not adverse to you putting some poems in this book, but let's make sure it works as a piece of prose narrative first, and then we can talk about maybe winding the poems into it if you feel that it's necessary to the narrative, to the dialogue, to the story, to the structure of the book. And she was very canny to any of my attempts to kidnap or to Trojan horse the poems in. That I thought, well, I'm not going to be able to fool her. So I ended up writing this almost like comparative companion collection of poems alongside the prose book, just to satisfy my own need to produce poetry alongside it. And that came a little bit after. And I was quite comfortable writing it as, I guess, a companion piece from some perspectives. And it would dilute or appease or attune some of the restlessness in me of not producing poems for the first time in my creative life, really. But it did mean by the time I'd signed off Boyfriends and edited it over this couple of year period, because it was a very slow cooked book, because I didn't want to put it out too early when it was too raw or too fleshy, when things seemed so immediate and necessary to, like, you know, clarion call them from the rooftops about the significance of this grief. Like a year later, I was actually reassessing the value of some of those more extreme emotions, and in terms of what they offered to the reader and how I felt about them now. So it meant I had this poetry collection that I'd written alongside it, which is now going to become my third poetry collection. So,
is that an exclusive, or has that been announced elsewhere?
That has not been announced elsewhere, so I can't really say too much about it, but it's done, it's there, we're editing it. It is definitely in conversations with Boyfriends. It's not a comparative piece, but definitely a collection of poems that is speaking to this book and was written alongside this book. It goes off on some of the more sort of wayward aberrations into some of the weirder things I got up into in childhood, and some of the places that I guess in a prose book I might have taken the reader to that would have been impossible to drag them back into the story because they were too fantastical or too smutty, or, you know, just a little bit inside out compared to where the narrative was leading them. So anyone who enjoys Boyfriends, I think, will definitely relish the poetry book as well.
Oh, well, I'm excited. And that's a good segue. I was just going to wrap by asking you what you're doing next. I guess it's the America tour and working on that.
So definitely this third poetry collection should come out next year. I'm working with a new editor on it that's really sort of challenged me, and it's the biggest collection of poetry I've produced yet in terms of the number of poems in it. Of course, I've been really lucky with the book covers as well, having had like Scott do one of them, and then John Gray, this brilliant artist, did Boyfriends that did all the covers for like Sally Rooney and Zadie Smith. So he's coming with me to do the next poetry book. So we're now just trying to flesh out how that's going to look and feel. And trying to take America by small storm for the next 3 weeks. So we're reading for like a Scottish government in the US event tonight, me, Holly and Irvin Welsh again. And then I'm in a very geeky way excited to get off to Montreal, then Harvard afterwards.
Yeah, and New York, which will be awesome.
New York, we're doing Brooklyn Book Festival there, and Greenlight Bookstore. So I've got 5 nights in New York when I'm out there too, which will be great.
Wow. Enjoy it.
Lots of Scottish diaspora at all the shows, which is good.
Love that.
Buy books, they fill seats, and I hear about what clans they hailed from 500 years ago.
Well, sadly, it's time to wrap up, but thank you so much, Michael, for being so open and generous, and thanks for writing this book. Honestly, it's beautiful. It made me cry, and it articulated experiences with loss that I'd never seen put into words or never even fully thought out myself. So I think it's a beautiful thing to put out into the world, and you should be awful proud. So relishing the whole thing. And
thank you, Naomi. You really connected to the book. You were such an insightful and tender and transient host, and the fact that you were like going off and reading the C.S. Lewis books that I was quoting and stuff, and the whole orbit of literature that came around it. But there it is. It's beautiful. It was just such a really brilliant experience. So thanks to you, and thanks to WayWORD as well. It's been a real pleasure to do this.
You're very welcome. And for the audience, you can buy Michael's book at any good bookshops. I think Waterstones in Aberdeen maybe have a couple of signed copies, and you can also get it at our festival bookshop Blackwell's. There's a base in King's Pavilion where the rest of the festival is, and also at their regular shop at 99 High Street in Old Aberdeen. And a big thank you to our BSL signer Leslie Crerar, and thank you to the media services team, the WayWORD Festival crew, Helen Lynch. Thanks to Creative Scotland, Aberdeen City Council and the University of Aberdeen, and to the dedicated team of students and staff and young people who put this whole festival together. And thank you, the audience, for coming. Hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. And yeah, hopefully see you soon. Michael, enjoy your trip.
Thank you. Cheers,
Bye,
guys.
everybody.